Avengers Endgame is finally out, and it's making people laugh and cry and mostly spend lots and lots of money. What is it about art and entertainment that really moves us? Also, is freedom finally rising in Venezuela? I'm Joel Kurtnitis.
And I'm Josh Hugo.
And you're listening to Constructive Interference. Well, as you can hear, the flu bug has invaded my household. I don't have a whole lot of voice to roll with this, but you know what? We just love our audience so much that I'm going to show up, I'm going to make a play here, and I'm going to do my best Louis Armstrong for the rest of the episode tonight, you know? Because like you get a whole different set of voices when you have a cold. I can suddenly sing Shere Khan from the Jungle Book, you know? I can do the Louis Armstrong impersonation. I see trees of green, you know? But I don't have my normal voice, which, you know, depending on your point of view, might be a positive or a negative. But anyway, so there's big things happening in the world right now. The Venezuelan people are turning against their dictator, Nicolas Maduro, and the battle for the future of their nation appears to be on. Have you seen anything about that, Josh?
Just the big headlines. I know something's going on, but that's about it.
We bring you the best in information here. So Venezuela, as a lot of Bernie Sanders critics have noted, is a socialist country. And a lot of folks will remember we did an episode on socialism not long ago where we referenced Venezuela and their really tragic descent into poverty and want at the hands of this dictator that they have, as well as a couple of dictators that they've had now in a row. And apparently the Venezuelan people have had enough. And they're rioting. They're up in arms in the streets. And I say up in arms, and I mean basically sticks and rocks against their military. And
Venezuela has that gun control. So
yes, but fortunately they don't have any school shootings. I'm sorry, my humor gets a little dark sometimes. Like, look, this is part of the. Let's not divorce this too strongly from the Second Amendment argument. A lot of people who make the Second Amendment argument on crime statistics only sort of ignore the broader issue of why it was put into place, which is the reason that the Venezuelan people are discovering right now. You want to be able to resist a tyrannical government in the event that you need to with more than sticks and rocks. But people are showing up in ridiculous numbers, which is and should be scary to any dictator. In fact, they're showing up in big enough numbers that the dictator himself, Maduro, reportedly had a flight out of the country booked today, but then ended up calling it off after he got in touch with Moscow and some other communist/socialist leaning countries that convinced him to stick around and wait it out. International intrigue is building around it, but right now I think the main thing that people are, well, at least what's trending on Twitter right now is there's a viral video that's out of an armored vehicle of the Venezuelan government, presumably, deliberately running into and running over a crowd of protesters. It's just a really alarming and disgusting video to watch, but it really shows you the urgency of the situation down there. And I looked at that and I thought, this might be the Tiananmen Square of our generation. I mean, a lot of people don't remember that, but I remember the pictures that came out of that. Even though I was super, super young at the time, but these democracy protests in China that came up in Tiananmen Square, Chinese government sent tanks out to quell them. And there's a famous photo, of course, of a lone Chinese person standing out there in front of one of the tanks as the tanks are approaching to basically run them over. And I wonder if that might be a wake-up call to our generation in that same way. Hey, look at the end result of socialism. Look at the things that we talked about. Do you think it'll have that sort of impact, Josh?
I have no idea. I think it ought to. It kind of blows my mind that people have such great faith in their government and in governments in general, where there are so many bad examples throughout history and even in modern times. And I would think that anybody looking at that video, because I have seen that video. I said before I wasn't real up on the scene, what's going on there, but I have seen that video you're talking about. And it kind of blows my mind that anybody could watch that, to watch literally a police vehicle, a government, quote unquote, peacekeeper vehicle, actually running over civilians, and look at that and think, yeah, you know what? Civilians don't need to have guns, and we should trust government for all of our needs. It just, I'm not sure where your mind can really be at to see that and not have your faith in the goodness and benevolence of government shaken somewhat.
Well, right. And I mean, of course, we have our own law enforcement issues here in America, and every country is going to have some, clashes and problems, and where civilians are treated as collateral damage, I guess. And that's totally different in scope than what we're talking about here, where you have violent confrontations happening between the government and the populace. And it's weighted to, where to the point where a small handful of people loyal to a dictator can still maintain control. And I think what I look at this for is this, it's kind of in a way, like my heart goes out to the people down there. I would do anything I can to support them as they push for democracy and for freedom. But I see a spark down there that really, I hope it doesn't take going through what they just went through to get us to have that same spark. And I don't know, I can't think of a better way to put that. But people today here in America, we like to protest things because we know nothing serious is ever going to happen to us, right? Like pretty much, okay, if it's really, really bad, you might get gas or you might get water cannon in an extreme event, But for the most part, nothing's going to happen to you. Your family's not going to go to jail. Nobody's going to starve you. You're not gonna have a price on your head. None of those things are going to happen. But if we keep going down this path that we're going, that's a very real possibility that shows up in our future. And then the question becomes, once again, will there be enough Patrick Henrys in the world that will stand up and say, do we love peace and tranquility too much to stand up and rebel against this government for freedom? And that's the problem, is that these Venezuelan people, they were promised that they would get equality. They were promised that they would get all these free things, right? And now they're eating zoo animals and pets, and so it's just like, and these people are not, I grew up with probably not enough knowledge of South America. I sort of thought at first glance, Venezuela looks like they're sort of a backward country where things are all messed up and run by drug gangs and whatnot. But no, this is a civilized, developed country that's sliding into chaos, and I think that the people have had enough. So good for them.
Did you see the Parks and Recreation episode with the Venezuelans?
I did not.
That is I forget which season it's in, but that I think is one of the best episodes of the show Parks and Recreation. But it's only relevant in this context because at the time, this came out probably about 10 years ago, and Venezuela being rich and the Venezuelan emissaries who came to America being wealthy and looking down upon the American yokels was like a joke in the episode, because it is true that Venezuela quite recently in history was a wealthy country, and this extreme poverty they're experiencing now has been pretty sudden and pretty recent.
Mm-hmm. So now the question becomes, can we learn from this before the millennial generation votes a bunch of socialists into power in America?
I hope so.
Yeah,
it's funny. You started this mentioning Endgame. Of course, the Endgame and its predecessor, Infinity War, are two of the most popular, I'll say most beloved movies in history, certainly two of the most profitable. And the main villain in these movies, Thanos, his goal is ostensibly benevolent, right? Thanos sees
from a certain point of view.
Well, from his own point of view. So Thanos is the big bad guy in these Avengers movies, because from his own perspective, he sees that there is suffering in the universe. There is inequality. You could say there's poverty in the universe. And Thanos' goal in the Avengers movies is literally to end poverty. He sees poverty in the universe and he wants to get rid of it. And so he has this plan that he's going to make everyone, impose his dictatorial will upon the universe, and he's going to end poverty. And it just strikes me as so, I guess, ironic that the masses of people, the masses of Americans and even internationally, would look at a character like that, would look at a character whose goal is to end poverty by taking control of the universe and imposing his will. And of course, he wants to kill a bunch of people. That's
Sure.
The catch. But from his own perspective, and look at the logistics of it, it's like he's kind of, unless you believe in individual freedom, unless you believe in individual rights, and unless you believe that individual freedom and rights supersede any social good, such as ending poverty, such as making people equal or whatever, Unless you believe that human rights and dignity supersede those things, then why is Thanos the bad guy? So it's
just because he wants to kill people. That's it. No, seriously. Like there is no. I have found in my. I guess maybe you can correct me here, but to my knowledge, you can't figure out who is the bad guy in Hollywood unless they kill someone. That's the only thing that's considered bad in Hollywood. Unless the bad guy kills someone, he's not the bad guy.
And not even always that. I mean, you've had movies about anti-heroes who do kill and murder people, but they're funny or something.
Right.
And so they're still a hero anyway, even though they're a murderous bad guy. They're funny, so we'll still like them.
Well, right. I mean, and yeah, I mean, so you saw Black Panther, right?
I did.
So Black Panther, you really couldn't tell throughout the movie whether Killmonger was the good guy or bad guy until he chokes the old lady, right? Like they literally had him choke an old lady so we would know that he was the bad guy.
I know.
Because up until that point, basically he made all the arguments that T'Challa himself ends up coming around to at the end of the movie. So it's like, was he really the bad guy, or did they just make him into a monster arbitrarily and sort of suddenly for the sake of the movie because Hollywood doesn't know how to make a bad guy that doesn't kill people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and of course the good guys kill people too. I mean, in any of these movies where there's fighting in combat, even superhero movies, like the good guys kill too. So, but it's like, so why, unless you believe in individual rights, freedoms, and dignities, unless you believe in the right to life, unless you believe that human beings have an inalienable right to life, then explain to me why Thanos is bad.
Yeah, I know it's a little bit rough. There's a lot of meaning in that.
Yeah.
And I was looking, I was going to come up with some cheesy segue to get us into that, but you've already got us there, So we
I'm sorry,
are going to shift
cheesy.
from. No, it's perfect. I mean, we talked about Venezuela, but honestly, before that developed what we wanted to get into, and for a lot of folks, looking at what's going on in the world can be a little scary, it can be a little serious. We wanted to look at things that make us tick in terms of arts and entertainment tonight. I am the furthest thing from an art critic. Okay, I remember finding an art critique book when I was a kid and looking at this, like, what on earth are they talking about? Like, like critiquing paintings and hey, this person was expressing this, that, and the other thing. I'm like, that just looks like a dirty countertop to me. Like, I have no idea what this is, and I'm just way too redneck overall to do that kind of thing. But I do enjoy a good story. And so a lot of what we're talking about, the meaning in these different movies and films and of course in games and books and all sorts of things like that, it's about stories. And so some of what we wanted to talk about tonight was just to go over some of our favorite stories in film and in games and in books and whatnot, and try to figure out what makes them good, what makes them great. And I think we've already touched on some of that. One of my biggest things in film, especially, is the complexity of a villain. I mean, you can make or break a film or a game with, a terrible, terrible, caricatured, one-dimensional villain, or a thoughtful, super complex one who you really have to think to determine what side he's on. I mean, that's honestly one of the biggest selling factors in any work of art.
Oh yeah, and we've discussed this is kind of a point of contention between myself and Joel. I'm not a big fan of the Marvel movies. But I did find Thanos to be a really interesting villain, when I did watch Infinity War. And that was because his motivation was so close to arguments you might expect a good guy to make. He's got a deep character. He's got real emotions. He's willing to make real sacrifices. And his ostensible goal is to make everybody happy. So I thought that was definitely, in my mind, the most interesting aspect of the whole, I guess, Avengers saga, was having that particular villain with that particular motive. Go ahead. Oh, I just wonder if people, like I said, it's like, unless you believe in the inalienable human right to life, why is Thanos bad? Of course, everybody knows Thanos
right
is
to
bad.
life.
Alien right to life, yes. the inalienable alien right to life that we see. Unless you believe in that, why is Thanos bad? So I just wonder, if people watching this movie, are they really thinking about it? I mean, these movies are immensely popular. Everybody loves them. You go to Walmart. If you go to Walmart, If you go to Target, sorry, I don't like Walmart. I know you said you're redneck, Joel, so I'm sure you think Walmart is just the best place to be. But
it's a great center of cultural learning, my friend.
Yes, I should go on some anthropological trips there. Anyway, so you go to Walmart and you see the little toy Thanos gauntlet there, so kids can pretend they're Thanos or whatever. But I just really wonder, these are so popular. Are people really thinking about them? Are people really thinking about why is Thanos bad and what lessons they can extract from that? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think people think he's bad because he punches the Avengers. Really, that's it. Like, I think that's what it comes down to. And I read a terrific article. I wish I could find it now. It's just an article on Medium that came out shortly after Infinity War. And I mean, I will say at the end of Infinity War, when I watched it at the theaters, I have had few jaw-dropping moments as strong as I had at the end of that movie. But I had read a great article that really discussed the fact that in Infinity War, Thanos is treated throughout the film as the protagonist. And it never occurred to me that that was true because I came into the film having watched, 20 other Marvel films, and I already knew Captain America. I already knew Thor. I already knew Iron Man. I already knew all of Thanos' opponents. And so I walked into this already familiar with them and already believing that they were the protagonist. But that's not how the story. If you cut off those movies and treated Infinity War by itself, you would get a story about Thanos. You would get a story about one character who rises above the odds and conquers his obstacles and gets everyone out of his way on a holy crusade to perform a sacred task and does it. Mm-hmm. And that's what you would get from that movie. And when you reverse it and start to look at it that way, it's like, wow, I mean, there's a lot of depth to that, and it's an incredibly bold decision for Marvel Studios to make to turn that into to take their heroes and turn them into the opposition to their main character. Right, the obstacles, right. They turn them into obstacles. And it was just really, really interesting way to do that. You will not, I assure you, our dear audience, we are not going to give any Endgame spoilers here. I did go to see Endgame on Friday. I enjoyed it. I will say I didn't enjoy it as much as I did Infinity War. Could have had something to do with the fact that I went there sick and it was 3 hours long. But either way, people are spending tons and tons of money on this. I mean, it had I think we're up to almost $1.4 billion now.
Something
it's been out for a week. Crazy, crazy stuff. It's just blowing up the records. And so what we wanted to talk about tonight is try to figure out, some of the things that have influenced us in terms of especially games and films, and try to figure out why, and kind of what makes them interesting. So, Josh, in the spirit of generosity, I'm going to let you go first. What's your number one influence that you want us to know about?
So the first item on my list is a game called Dishonored, which came out a couple years ago. It was a last-gen game for PS3 and Xbox 360. All of these three things on my list tonight are all games. Of course, there have been all sorts of movies and books that I found to be very excellent and had an impact on me. But recently, actually, a lot of the artworks that to me have been really excellent have been games, and Dishonored is one of them. So Dishonored is a stealth first-person action game. Where you kind of sneak around and have the option to fight or do things stealthily as you choose. And it's really fun, has really excellent mechanics in it. But what really struck me and stuck with me about this game is the way it encourages you to have empathy for the enemies. Now, in most games, the enemies are basically just like stormtroopers, from Star Wars. For all purposes, faceless, no personalities, no backstory, not really even characters. They're just there for you to shoot because you got to have a target, something to shoot at, right? You got a gun, you got to have something to shoot at. But in Dishonored, they give you this ability. It's actually an artifact that you carry as the player that allows you to sort of read the thoughts of the people around you. And so as you're sneaking around through these environments, you can overhear the conversations that the enemy characters are having and also actually sort of read their minds. And by doing so, hear what they are thinking about the events of the day. What do they think about you and why do they want to catch you? Or what are they planning to do tonight, after work if you don't kill them? Or what are they afraid of? What are their goals? You'll peer into the mind of an enemy character who is there standing in opposition to you, an obstacle you have to get past, and yet you can read his thoughts and know that he is doing this job because he needs to get money for his, little sister who's sick or things like that. That just really impressed me. It impressed me with this idea that the people who you oppose, those people are actually people, even though they're against you, even though they oppose you, that doesn't mean that they necessarily are bad people. And it doesn't mean that you should have contempt for them. It doesn't mean that you should, disregard their feelings or their worth. You can still have empathy for them, and maybe you even understand why they oppose you. And I just really loved that aspect of the game, how it really brought that home for me. Just the idea of having empathy for enemies.
That's amazing.
Also encouraged me to play in stealthy mode because in Dishonored you have the option to not kill people if you don't want to. You have a lot of freedom. So also the fact that you could do this really encouraged me to take the stealthy route.
That's amazing. No, that was on my list. Dishonored was one that I had fully intended to play. I read a lot about it. It looked like a great game. And then I got introduced to Skyrim, and that was the end. So
that's a sad story.
Just sort of left. I mean, just anything Elder Scrolls. It consumes so much time, man. Like I could spend the rest of my life playing those games and probably never finish all the quests. But you're right about video games in general, though. And I honestly think that video games are the storytelling medium of the future because, look, there's different levels of storytelling. Like, honestly, I think there's a sense in which movies are actually sort of the base level where you're taking someone else's imagination in terms of vision and in terms of sound and all of these things and putting it together and interacting with it in sort of a one-dimensional sense. Books, I think, go a little bit deeper than that because you can use your imagination. Video games, I think, are definitely at least on the book level, maybe more, because they're interactive, right? You're not
if
just
made
right.
Well, yeah.
Like you're well, right. Obviously, if they're made well, but if
we're not talking about Call of Duty here, sorry guys, sorry Call of Duty fans.
Well, I would fight you on the Modern Warfare series, but we don't have time for that tonight. So I'm just basically saying that they're interactive. There's ways within video games that you can apply your own judgment and your just in the ways that you were talking about with Dishonored there. You engaged with that game in a deeper way than you could really pull off with a movie because you got to decide what to do with the information that was coming into you, which is also incidentally why they have such a terrible time making video game movies work. They're usually terrible movies. I mean, sometimes you have to watch them anyway.
Also a reason why... Yeah, well, I've yet to see one that was good. I would make a good one, but depending on the subject matter, what game I was making a movie of. But another reason why games are good for that is because you have time. In a movie, the movie has to proceed at a brisk clip. It has to have a certain pacing to be over, in 2 hours or 3 hours. And it can only look at one thing at a time. Whereas in a game, you can stop and linger. It's like in a game, I have time to stop and listen to the other characters talk or you eavesdrop on their thoughts for 15 minutes and learn about them. Whereas in a movie, it just isn't really possible. So that's something I think that games can share with books, is that they can be slow and take their own pace.
Right, like in Skyrim, where you can stop and collect 58,000 mushrooms and butterflies.
Sure, Joel.
Yeah. No, I didn't have a hoarding problem, not at all.
And carry them all without having any visible means of carrying.
There's actually a really, really funny YouTube video about, I think it's a college humor thing about Skyrim Hoarders Edition, or Hoarders Skyrim Edition, rather. Just hilarious. Anyway.
I think I saw that.
So my first influence, and also coming from the video game genre, Halo 2. Actually, for at least one of the same reasons that you mentioned, that it dignifies and adds a level of complexity to the enemy from Halo 1, which was the Covenant. Halo is an epic FPS to start with. One started off with an incredible story where you basically had three. Well, okay, I mean, there's elements of it that anybody would say are probably ripped off from StarCraft, but in 2, you start off, and I think the opening sequence in Halo 2's campaign really gives it depth and dimension, because you start off basically right after the events of Halo, the original Halo Combat Evolved. You look at it from the perspective of your protagonist, who made it through, defeated the enemy, survived, and escaped, being celebrated and rewarded by his military leadership, and then you have an alternate perspective. You keep flipping back and forth between that and the leader of the Covenant forces that were sent to defeat the protagonist, and how they are being humiliated and branded as heretics and traitors for their failure. And that is the dynamic with which you start the game. You actually switch back and forth between playing Master Chief, the human protagonist, and the Arbiter, who is the leader of the Covenant military. Well, at least an arm of the Covenant military. And the two of them have this rivalry back and forth that you get to play both sides of until eventually they come together. And it's just a really, really interesting storyline. That's just one of the elements that brings it a lot of depth. Another element that I thought was fantastic about it is the area of exploration, which is really pivotal in video games for, just like you said, having that time to go look around, to go find stuff that you wouldn't typically find, to invent new ways to play the game, to determine different strategies that you can go about, different ways to do the same things. And that was just a really, as you progress through the campaign, obviously, if you're not playing it on Legendary, if you're playing it on Legendary, you're pretty much just hiding for your life for like 6 hours straight. It's like all you can do. But if you're not playing on Legendary, I mean, it's storytelling. It's video game storytelling at its very best. Because throughout the thing, it's not like you're deciding who's right and wrong. There's a very clear right and wrong. But what I love about it is that right and wrong exists outside of the personalities involved. Master Chief is not right because he is Master Chief. Master Chief is right because he knows the truth of what's happening. And he's trying to share that. And the people who do not know that truth are not wrong because they're just evil, villains who just like to see people suffer. They're people who believe a lie, or they're entities who believe a lie. And so that's just something that I think was really, really complex and really interesting about Halo 2. That's why it makes the top of my list.
Yeah, I love the idea in Halo 2 of how you play. You play as the guy who was your enemy, and it's almost like a repentance arc where he eventually, by learning the truth, ends up being the good guy alongside. Just really, really pretty cool.
Indeed.
So my number 2 here was also a game. This game is The Witness, which came out pretty recently for PlayStation 4 and PC. I think it's on Xbox One also. But The Witness is a game by Jonathan Blow. Now, if I had to pick somebody who I would say, not saying that I'm especially knowledgeable and somehow know about all the artists out there, but if I were to have to pick a guy who I would say is the greatest living artist right now, I would say it is Jonathan Blow, which is a bizarre name. That's his name, Mr. Blow. Jonathan Blow, he's made this game, The Witness, and before that, another just brilliant game called Braid. But I love The Witness because I felt like it was just a powerful metaphor for the experience of life itself, but more specifically for the way education and knowledge help a person in life and the way that education and knowledge come to a person. So The Witness works. It's basically a puzzle game, and you wander around this island. And as is the way in many such games, there are all these locked off areas, and you have to find keys to get into them. That's so far very, very boring and ordinary. Every game has that, right? You wander around and find keys to the unlocked areas. Except The Witness is different because you don't have any sort of an inventory. The keys are actually knowledge. Because every single puzzle that you encounter in The Witness is fundamentally the same. It's always a grid, and you just got to draw a line through the grid, and that's it. You draw the correct line on the grid, you win the puzzle, you advance. And it never changes, except there are rules. There are symbols on the grids, or perhaps where the grids are positioned in their environment, different factors that communicate to you what the solution is, except that at first you don't know how to read them. You'll come up against a puzzle, and it's open. You can try it. You can draw lines in this grid, but you have no idea what to do because you don't know what the symbols on the grid mean, and you don't know if its position in the environment is important. Are the colors around it important? Is the fact that it's mounted on a tree important? You have no idea, and so you can't do it. But then as you travel around this island, you gradually pick up the knowledge. You learn the keys, and after you've learned the key, then you can progress.
That's crazy.
And this metaphor... It's really fun, but and there's more to it as well. But I mean that's pretty much what the game is about. And through the use of the environment, there's no explicit narration story. The character has no explicit identity, but there's all sorts of statues that are positioned around. And through the statues and the architecture, you basically are told this story of people striving to understand where they are and why. And I'm going to go ahead and spoil the end of the game because it's important to.
Well, at least you gave the warning.
So yeah, I'm going to spoil the end of the Witness here, guys. So in the Witness, so you go through this whole island and you eventually unlock everything. Well, not everything, because there's like billions of extra things to unlock. I never got them all, but you unlock all the areas, and then you go to the end of the game, and you're expecting some sort of a grand finale, right? You're expecting some sort of a big reveal that'll tell you what it's all about or whatever. But that's not what happens. Instead, you go through this very short, very simple sequence that is obviously a metaphor for your character dying. You die, and that's how the game ends. But then you respawn again at the start of the game with everything locked again, which seems lame and stupid until you realize that even though you have respawned at the beginning of the game with everything locked again, for you it's unlocked because you have the keys in your mind when you start, and so you can just go out and do something and get everywhere like from the beginning. And I just so there's a couple of reasons why I love this. One, I love it because it just powerfully demonstrates the value of knowledge. Basically, you're in this environment, and if you have knowledge, then the environment is open to you. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want, and just be free to wander around this place. Whereas if you are ignorant, then you're powerless. And I also loved is the way you were starting at the beginning, just the idea that education is so valuable, that this new respawned character, because they have the benefit of the knowledge acquired by the forebearer, because they have been educated, the world is open to them. Whereas for the ignorant character at the beginning, it was closed. And it was just a simple idea, kind of a basic idea, but the way the game communicated that was, to me, very powerful. And what I feel like I learned something from The Witness, because I felt like I learned to, I guess, sympathize with ignorant people. To understand that if I sympathize with, yes, I would, but
that's how you became qualified to be co-host here, Josh. Sympathizing with ignorant people.
But we have such a tendency, Joel, when we see someone having a hard time doing something, when we see someone acting what we think is stupid, it's like we think we want to judge them, because like if we know how to do something, if we know the right answer to something, well, we assume the other person must be either stupid or wicked because they're not doing it right. What's wrong with them? But I feel like playing The Witness really helped me to understand, well, maybe that person who's doing it wrong, they don't have the key that I have. Mm-hmm. Because of my experience, my education, I know how to do something. I have the key, and they don't. And so I shouldn't judge them, look down on them for failing. I should have empathy for them and maybe seek to help them get the key.
That is a really powerful set of conclusions to draw from a grid drawing game.
Well, I highly recommend it. If you've ever, that's The Witness. You should play it.
I mean, I'm willing to give it a shot. That's for sure. I mean, what it sounds like to me so far from what you described is basically all the really frustrating parts of Half-Life without any of the like ninja chick shooting. It's like, here's a puzzle. You've been walking around shooting people like a normal FPS for like an hour and a half. Here's a puzzle that will take you 6 days. So, yeah.
Except fun.
Well, right. So, presumably, yeah. So, all right. So, my number 2, I'm a fan of sequels. This is about to become obvious because my first choice was Halo 2. Assassin's Creed 2. First Assassin's Creed was a good game. It was, trend-setting in its own way. 2 really added another level. And the sense in which I really appreciated the game, of course, anybody familiar with the Assassin's Creed series, it's a historical fiction. The original one was set in the Middle East during the Crusades, and it tracks this sort of kind of a multifaceted narrative about the Knights Templar versus the Assassins, these two orders that are sworn enemies to each other, trying to recover artifacts of great power from the past. That's probably the shortest, easiest way to describe that. But 2 starts off in Renaissance Italy. And to be honest, obviously high school history, I had a general familiarity with the Renaissance and with Italian city-states and what was happening. I did not have in my mind a lot of clarity into what that looked like. And I feel like Assassin's Creed 2 just brought history to life. And 3 did as well. Like I appreciated 3 sort of addressing the American colonies, but 2 especially. Like, if you are a fan of history, you really, really, really need to play Assassin's Creed 2, and potentially 3 as well. They incorporate the storytelling of this fictional narrative into the actual goings on. And you learn about actual Renaissance leaders and characters and families and how they were connected, the things that they fought about, the power struggles that went on back then. And obviously they take some creative license, so you probably should bounce it off some books, you know. But everything about it, the attention to detail in that game is just absolutely striking. And then, you know, from an artistic perspective as well, visually, it is just the most gratifying thing you can possibly play. I mean, it's really, really amazing. You're going into all of these buildings in Renaissance Italy, in these Italian city-states, and you're learning about them. Like, you can actually learn about these. Here's this historic cathedral. It was built by so-and-so. It was conquered in the year so-and-so by this, and it had a fire, and here's the people who were involved in that. Like, you can actually learn legitimate history from this. And it was just really, it was an immersive experience to me that made me look at it and go, wow, you would really only have to advance a step or 2 beyond that level of gameplay to get to the point where you have an entirely new way of communicating history that's not just history books. And that, to me, is a really exciting prospect. The idea that we could go all Ready Player One on the subject of history and say, okay, you want to go back and look at the Library of Alexandria? Here it is. Go there. You know, like that. It's just a really, really fascinating concept that we could recreate things from history in that level of detail. So I just really appreciated that about the game. I mean, it's got its own strengths and storytelling and character development and whatnot. But it was that historical element that really caught it for me. That was just an amazing example of how to create a great story by weaving it into existing great stories that people already know and love. And I thought that was just brilliant. Have you played any Assassin's Creed series, Josh?
I have. I've not been a huge fan of them, but I did buy Assassin's Creed Origin just for the reasons you mentioned. Assassin's Creed Origin actually takes what you're talking about a step further and has a tour mode.
Wow.
Where, yeah,
homeschooling just got easier.
It's a very, yeah. Well, that's why I bought it. I bought Assassin's Creed Origins for the tour mode because basically it has a really, just like you said, just a gorgeous, detailed, vibrant recreation of ancient Egypt. And the tour mode, it's like going to a museum. It just gives you like 50 different historical tours you can walk through and see how they lived, see how the pyramids are built, see how the Romans built aqueducts. It's really, I think, very useful as a teaching tool.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So what's number 3?
Number 3 for me, another game of mine.
More games, jeez, man.
Edith.
Move out of your parents' basement already.
I do. Sorry, I know. I have been told in no uncertain terms by some people that I am immature and juvenile because I like games, but I have a thick skin. I can take the criticism. Anyway, What Remains of Edith Finch? A fairly recent game, independent game, and man, I love this game. I'm going to say I love this game because it is a powerful pro-life artwork.
Really?
And it's pro-life. It's pro-life in both senses of the word. For one thing, it's because, okay, I'm going to have to give some spoilers here. The game has a nested perspective where you're playing actually like 3 layers deep. Basically, at one point you're playing as a character who is referenced in a diary being read by somebody who's writing a letter to somebody else. Anyway, but most of the game you're playing from the perspective of a pregnant teenager. The eponymous Edith Finch. And it's not a lot of details given about her scenario, but she is a teen mother to be. And she appears to be all alone in the world. No father is mentioned. But in spite of this, she basically spends the entire game writing a letter to her unborn child. And if it's from first person perspective, so if you look down, you can see her belly.
Wow,
which is really interesting. Yeah, so she spends the whole game writing this letter to her unborn child because she thinks it's important that he know his family history. And so then the game is basically telling the history of the Finch family as told through their the artifacts they leave through their diaries or through their, paintings that they left behind in this big old house. And ultimately, this diary with all this information is given to the boy, who is, in the player character's belly for most of the game. But it's just amazing because all of these, the Finches, the whole family clan, they are all what you think of as losers. They all are kind of eccentric weirdos who never really amounted to anything. A lot of them died young. One of them, who you play as, actually, again, spoilers, actually dies as a baby. There's one section where you play as a little baby who ends up drowning in the bathtub, and you're playing as that character. And so, yeah, all the Finches, they're mostly eccentric, they're mostly weirdos. Most of them die young, or they die stupidly. But you're playing from their perspectives, and it really just kind of drives home the point to you as the player that all of these people, despite them being loser weirdos, they were still valuable and still had dignity. And Edith, who you're playing as, she thinks they're important enough that she's crawling around this house, trying to find all these memories because she wants to communicate them to her son. And I just loved that idea, communicated to me very powerfully through this game, that everybody matters. And everybody's life has dignity and has value. And ultimately, that's the theme that ties it all together. And I mean, I'm sure there are, but in my personal experience, I'm not sure I ever experienced artwork that to me communicated that quite so profoundly. And I was really touched by it.
Wow.
And I just found it to be like just a really powerful pro-life message.
Wow, that's a really intense game. I had not heard of that. I'm going to go look it up now, though. I mean, that sounds kind of heartbreaking, but it also sounds really deep, and it sounds like it's got an amazing message to it.
Oh, it is heartbreaking, but it's so good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of good art is, right? And so is the third one that I'm about to mention. Mine is not a game, so I'm gonna break the gaming cycle here. My favorite movie of all time is Braveheart. I know I've mentioned it on here before. I can't help it. It has been incredibly influential in my life. Not exactly a happy movie, but the notion of it being great art. I mean, I know it makes a lot of film critic lists and stuff like that because it's a good storytelling, but it's also got an incredible message and moral. To me, if I had to distill it down, and I guess seeing that especially as a young man growing up, it's a powerful narrative on courage and leadership that I've really not found anywhere else. I mean, you read, when you're a young guy, especially a Christian young guy in a Christian and church family, you grow up reading a lot of classic epics and tales of heroism and military adventures and stuff like this. There's a lot of that, and seeing that was kind of the first time where it all kind of came together for me. Because a lot of times in books, and this is true of the superhero genre, I think especially, a lot of times the question that is the prime question in the story is not one really of choice and responsibility. It's just one of having situations foisted upon you and making of them what you can. This is actually a complaint that I have with a lot of modern hero tales. Is that there's just really not a lot of complexity to the decision making in them. That's not true in Braveheart. And as a young guy growing up, you kind of look around and go, how can I be? There's this canyon between me and leadership, and I don't know how to get there. I'm never going to be a leader. I'm not suited to be a leader. I don't know how to lead. Here's these great men that I look up to in history or in current times, and I don't know what separates me from them, and I don't know how to get there. And Braveheart, I think watching that movie was the first time where I've kind of looked at it and went, oh, you mean that great leaders that we look at throughout history are just normal guys? Like they're normal people who do extraordinary things, usually by sacrifice. That's what sets them apart. And also I think just the idea that great men don't always see themselves as great men, in their own eyes and in their own times. They might not be appreciated at all. They might be condemned. They might be, killed as traitors. And many of the people that we look back at in those times and think, "Wow, I wish I could have been like them." They didn't consider themselves glamorous or glorious at all, and many of those around them didn't either. And it's just a really powerful message in there that says, well, first of all, it's just very empowering to say, if you have courage, you can make things happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. And I'm not talking about, courage like I'm Captain Marvel and I'm invincible and I'm going to go blow up a spaceship. Not that kind of thing, but putting your life in your hands, putting the lives of others in your hands and saying, we are going to go make a difference despite what it might cost us and despite the pain that might come from it because of what we believe is right. And so it's just, there's so many themes that you can pull out of that movie. But at the bottom of it all is an analysis within that talk about courage. It's an analysis of what's really important. And it ties the notion of courage into what's really important, what's really valuable. Of course, the money line from the film is every man dies, not every man really lives. And that sort of encapsulates it together, right? Like you go throughout life thinking of ways not to die. But when you're looking at men of that caliber, they ask different questions. It's not how can I escape pain? How can I avoid pain? How can I avoid death? How can I avoid embarrassment? It's how passionately, how courageously can I pursue what I know to be right? And is it worth what I'm willing to pay for it? And that's just something that to me was life changing. As I watched that growing up, and just really it changed a lot of what I think. But Josh, tell me something. What's something that you maybe thought was something that was like unexpectedly good? Like when you're looking at art or media of the different types that we're talking about, games and movies, what's something that you really had no expectations for and you thought like overall was very kind of meh, but then you came away from it having learned something or kind of surprised at the way that it impacted you, I guess?
Well, this isn't a very deep lesson, perhaps, but the Lego Movie is one of my favorite comedies. I saw the trailers for the Lego Movie, and they just looked really stupid, and I was like, what? How can they think that a Lego Movie is a good idea? That's the worst idea ever. And then I saw it, and I was like, this is hilarious. And it's just my sort of humor. It's like semi-random, semi-stream of consciousness, but like yet united around an actual plot and themes, and just setting it all as being, toys that are sort of acting out the subconscious of a child it just worked. And it was way better than I expected.
Yeah, that was a great movie. And I think it really shows that there's a big market, with that movie, as well as things like Deadpool. I think, there's a big market for, some movies that are kind of self-aware, especially on the comedy strings. Like if they're kind of self-aware, poke fun at themselves, poke fun at modern culture, it's very different than, I've been watching some of the older movies lately, some old like black and white movies, and they took comedy very differently back then. It's not better or worse, it's just very different. And Lego Movie is definitely an example of that. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. Lego Batman as well was just terrific. I mean, it was just right up my alley. So one that I thought was really unexpected. And this is one of those sort of confession times, right? Like I'll admit sometimes that I listen to some cheesy pop music every now and then. Same thing for this. Like I watched a movie called The Covenant. It was a terrible movie overall. Like it didn't have a whole lot of redeeming value to it. But there was one plot element in there that I thought was kind of brilliant and has kind of stuck with me because of its lessons that I think it can impart in real life. And the notion was, I mean, so the plot of the movie goes like, there's these descendants of the Salem witches up in the Northeast, and they have metaphysical powers. They can do things. They can make magic happen. But the catch is, it costs them their life essence or life force or whatever. It shortens their life every time they use these abilities. And so the movie that starts out kind of like, oh, look, here's a bunch of wild teenagers who can do magic. It quickly becomes a narrative about addiction and about how the choices that you make, especially in your youth, can dramatically impact what happens for the rest of your life or can end your life, and how responsibility is, having the ability to do things and often choosing not to do them because of what they will cost. And it was just a really interesting, I never expected that from that movie. It's just kind of your average angsty teenager movie back then. I was sure that it was going to be terrible and lame. And for the most part it was, but that was a really important lesson that I thought I was able to pull out of it. Probably not, not as important as a Lego Movie, Josh, but still I had fun with it.
Yeah, Lego movies. That's an important movie there. I wonder though, because it's like so the Covenant. You say, well, it wasn't a very good movie. You're not really recommending it to us, but yet you say you found this. You abstracted this really important meaning out of it. So I just wonder, like I was kind of started out with talking about the Avengers. It's like I really wonder how much do audiences actually think about what they're watching or reading or playing. Because it just seems to me like a lot of these really popular movies, really popular artworks have messages that somehow don't seem to be communicated clearly to the people who enjoy them. And why is that?
I mean, well, a lot of it's the skill of the storyteller, right? So you have sometimes it's just the production where the messaging can get lost. But I do think that people do. I mean, I think that people can tell a thoughtful film. I mean, when you see, there's some examples, I think, in Will Smith's career. You got 7 Pounds and you have Pursuit of Happiness, both of which I thought were amazingly thoughtful films. Had a lot to say about responsible living and about priorities and about personal responsibility and freedom and what it means to be free, what it means to be happy. A lot of these giant themes were covered, and they weren't necessarily, action-packed thrill rides like Avengers, but people definitely took some value from them. And I think, especially, I think from the perspective of a Christian, the challenge is to do what Paul says: prove all things and hold fast that which is good. You can watch a movie that's 90% crap, and sometimes that 10% is worth sticking around, and it'll stick with you for a long time and positively impact your life. I mean, that's my take, I guess. What do you think?
Oh, I don't know. It was a sincere question.
Nice. A sincere, not rhetorical from Josh. Wow.
Nope.
Well, you know what? We've asked each other a lot of questions, but this week we're going to be asking you, the audience, some of what your influences are, trying to find out what are the things in what you might call modern literature, whether it's games or movies, that make you think, that have taught you life lessons, that have kind of made you look at the world in a different way. What are some of those influences? I mean, we could clearly, Josh and I'm sure could ramble for another 2 hours on things that we like. Well, if I had the voice for it anyway. But we'll be asking you that on social media this week. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at The CI Show and Facebook.com/The CI Show. You can join the conversation there. I'm really interested to see what you guys say about what has influenced you, and I think more broadly, how much influence these things can have. There's a great quote I heard from Andrew Fletcher that says, "Let me write the songs of a nation, and I care not who writes its laws." I think that's probably applicable to movies and video games too. But we'll find out what you think this week, and we'll talk to you again in a few days. Thanks again for listening to Constructive Interference.